Something is only a contradiction as long as we consider a limited number of variables. We're mainly going to talk about math and logic to help show that this is the case, and my first conjecture is that logic is a purely two-dimensional science. It really only concerns itself with states like true or false, and at its best is drawn in tables and graphs, which are stuck in two dimensions. This is, in many ways, a good thing. It makes logic really useful, but we'll get into its limitations and why logic is not the hero it's sometimes praised to be, though it is a very useful tool. Secondly, we'll use what I'll call poetic mathematics. My degree is in math, and math itself is not limited in dimensions, which is important, but I'm going to take some liberties here for the sake of presentation, and also I want to be sure to remind everyone that I'm a poet first and foremost. In logic, there are things called tautologies and contradictions. Tautologies are things that are true no matter what, like, oh, it's always in the last place I look. That is a tautology because once you found the thing you were looking for, you'd not keep searching for it. Meaning, by definition of finding something, that thing you were looking for will always be in the last place you look. In general, though, tautologies are created by using either or of direct opposites. So like, either it is true or it is false. The whole statement will always be valid because it's just two possible outcomes, and it has to be one of those. Conversely, a contradiction is something that is false no matter what. Usually, this is accomplished by just saying one thing and then its opposite, and so you can change the previous sentence with just an and. It is true and it is false, where both can't be true at the same time, making an invalid statement no matter what. For example, if I said, John is dead and he is not dead, we have a contradiction because someone can't be alive and dead. Or can they? We'll get into that. Next, we will use math. Specifically, our definition for a contradiction will have to do with points. We will say a contradiction is that two distinct points take up the exact same area, which shouldn't make any sense because if they take up the same area, then they should just be the same thing. Like these points here. First, you'll notice that in both cases for math and logic, both of the objects of the sentence must be considered within the same dimension. If one of them is moved to a different dimension, it starts to change things, and we run into problems. In logic, when this happens, it's considered a fallacy. The fallacy is called equivocation, and equivocation is a way of making a bad faith argument where you change the definition of the thing in the middle of the argument. So if I use the statement, which maybe you have heard before, if you don't respect me, I won't respect you. One of the things the speaker who says this probably falls into is equivocation fallacy, which is using two different definitions for respect. The first one is meant to mean reverence, or something more like worshipful submission. The second is more like basic human dignity. The statement could be translated to, if you don't treat me with reverence, I won't treat you with dignity. And now you have something that is obviously not proportional in give and take, even though it presented itself as being rational and equal. So, because of this fallacy, I couldn't get around the contradiction in my earlier example of logic by redefining the word dead to mean something different in the middle of the sentence. John is dead and John's memory lives on is something beautiful and sentimental because of the contrast, but not a contradiction, just more specific. So, if I redefined dead to mean lack of legacy, then as long as I use the same definition in both cases, I would still get a contradiction in saying that John is dead and he is not. I could get around the contradiction by using a fallacy in some sense, but really in most cases it's just people using poetry, not fallacies. Things that make for bad argumentation often make for very good connection, which is interesting, but probably another video. Let's get back to our math example of the 2 points taking up the same place. In this case, again, they have to be constrained to the same dimension. Generally, when we work with points, we work in 2 dimensions, so let's do that. We probably would not be wrong to define the contradiction as something like this. 2 distinct points, point 1 and point 2, equal to x1, y1, and x2, y2. So, in our example of point 1 equals 1, 2, and point 2 equals 1, 2, x1 equals x2, and y1 equals y2, and we have a contradiction because they're the same thing. They aren't 2 distinct points. But this specifically is only a contradiction when we're stuck in two dimensions. If we add another dimension, it actually doesn't matter if the x and y values end up being the same, because we now have a third variable to consider, which we can call z. We could still have two different points if x and y are the same, so our mathematical definition for a contradiction fails at higher dimensions. Again, we could just adjust by having it add in another dimension, but the point is that our original method doesn't work at higher dimensions. So if we're discussing points in time, whether or not two things can exist in the same place at the same time yet be distinct, it can only provably be a contradiction if we constrain our dimensions. And by dimensions here, I also mean the number of variables. By adding in another variable, it's the same thing as adding a dimension in math. And variables, in this case, are just things we take into consideration, right? So that means that the thing which is a contradiction is only a contradiction depending on what you take into account for it. Or, at least, it is only definably a contradiction. I make that delineation because if you move it up in dimensions, the last part is technically undefined, meaning it might still be a contradiction, but it's statistically way less likely because you now have infinite options, but it is actually just impossible to prove either way. What do I mean? Okay. We've been working a lot with points so far, but the reality is that no trend can be determined by a single point. Moreover, nothing about higher dimensions can really be said definitively when using just a single point. So let's take our point example again of 1, 2. In order to move it up a dimension, we would have to define this point as the intersection of two lines, namely just where x equals 1 and y equals 2, right? Which should make plenty of sense. So we're going to integrate with respect to z. You don't really need to know what that means, but for the sake of this example, it's just the way we're going to move up a dimension and add z as our next dimension. When we integrate, we actually get two planes, which I'm aware looks insane, but all it is we took our two lines and we stretched them out sideways. But all of our x values now correspond to x equals 1 times z plus c1 and y equals 2 times z plus c2, where the coefficient of z is just what the point was before. So for x it's 1, for y it's 2. And so we don't know what c is in either case, c1 or c2. But it does in fact have to be some number that is constant. It's not a variable, it doesn't change like x, y, and z. Here's the problem. Two things. First, it is possible that at this higher dimension, we still have a contradiction. This only happens if c1 equals 1, c2 equals 2, and z equals 0, as seen above, where a contradiction still exists if the planes cross at the point we had before. So it has more conditions already to get a contradiction, which is important when thinking about contradictions, because if they truly exist, then they're not as simple as we often think they are, but maybe even more importantly, we can't prove that this is the case. We have too many unknowns and not enough information to solve, meaning it's impossible to tell whether or not there is actually a contradiction anywhere. We can't solve for a contradiction given a point, or even a host of them. What we would need is a function. Even if we only had a bunch of points, we could try to fit a function to it after the fact using this iterative equation, but this is not the function which produced these points. It's just one that fits them. The distinction is important because even if we use this to prove a contradiction, it doesn't mean that the contradiction exists in the real world, because this is not the function in the real world. It's an approximation of a function, given our own possibly biased set of ill-measured data. Even after all of that, we would still have to integrate and compare functions and see if they interact at a higher dimension. But either way, without a lot more information and computational effort, we simply cannot conclude whether they do or do not contradict. It's far more likely that they don't, especially in this case, because that c on each of them can basically be equal to anything, and that the contradiction is unlikely, but maybe more importantly, unprovable. So, let's take more examples. Someone cannot be mean and nice at the same time, which is a statement about a contradiction, but one which could only be true if the dimension is properly constrained. For instance, someone can be mean to someone else, but nice to themselves at the same time. Or someone can be mean to themselves, all while being nice to someone else. And we can see they could have the same amount of meanness in either situation, but there is a dimension of niceness too, making them both exist at the same time. Or what about if we split it on different axes of physically and mentally by adding in a variable? Can someone feel a desire or have thoughts that are mean, all while helping someone in action? Why not? In either case, if we add in another dimension, you can start to see that these two things could easily exist in the same place at the same time. As another example, let's take a common one I have heard. A paradox. Can God create a rock so heavy that even he cannot lift it? At first, this seems altogether unsolvable, and has stumped many people, but it is simply a bad faith question. Firstly, the statement presupposes that God exists, and that he has the power to create. We can conclude from that information that in the question, God exists in a dimension higher than the rock itself. So the rock is a derivative of him in some ways, and that is how he creates it ex nihilo, as it were. Meaning, if we properly adjust the question semantically and use a different example, then this supposed paradox would be similar to if Shakespeare could write about a rock that is so heavy that he could not write himself into the story to lift it. Shakespeare, like God, is on a different, higher plane of existence from his creation, and thus there's no paradox at all. It's a neat trick where you can constrain the dimensions of a play area such that the answer cannot be found inside of it, which is supposed to lead people to believe that no answer exists. But the question itself basically bars the person from the answer. By constraining the dimensions of the elements in the question, we can make answering it functionally impossible. This happens in logic all the time. Because it is constrained to two dimensions, it always runs into paradoxes, and it always will. That doesn't make logic bad, it's just a drawback that ought to be kept in mind. And as we have seen, math gets pretty complicated and convoluted as we move up in dimensions, so it's harder to just apply to real life when compared to logic, but still very possible, obviously. But this whole idea has wild implications for our lives, far beyond whatever any of you choose to do with math or logic, because we do this all the time. We ask questions that cannot be answered, or accept paradoxes that aren't actually because we are stuck in a certain dimension of thinking. We do this for political parties, either conjuring them in our own mind or seconding them when others postulate, if you vote for so-and-so, you are heartless, or if you vote for this, then you are stupid. And both offer themselves very readily as contradictions, that no compassionate person could vote this way, and no intellectual person could vote that way. But by simply adding in another dimension for consideration, both of these contradictions are pretty easily disproven. And not by excusing either. This is important. To say someone made a decision because they are afraid or angry or some other reason does not solve the contradiction. It simply distracts. It's not a solution. At best, it's pity and condescension to say someone made the wrong or heartless or stupid decision because they were raised wrong or because they're scared or broken, though it may be true. In fact, it still is a heinous type of misattribution wherein you rob the object of your thoughts of their autonomy. What I mean to say is that the person who voted this or that way does have a heart and a brain and a will of their own. They may have compassion or intelligence or free will, and may even have any of those things to a higher degree than yourself. But you have no real way of devising if that is true or not, because all you have is a point, and you cannot find a function for it, and cannot prove a contradiction from it. There is a dimension of consideration you are missing if the entire logic of your argument only holds as long as something isn't considered, or as long as what is considered is unprovable. And I'm not arguing here for the benefit of the doubt. You should not generally just assume someone is compassionate when they've given no proof for it. But also, you cannot conclude that they lack compassion even if they have given proof for it in the form of a single point, or even a couple points. Once you add a dimension and try to solve, you probably still cannot prove that they do not have compassion. So, you have no right to treat them like they don't. Maybe even more damaging, We make these kinds of contradictions in our relationships. The only reason he did this is because he is stupid or mean. And if he were not stupid or mean, he would not have done this. It would then be a contradiction in your mind to say that he did this and that he's not stupid. But if we add in another dimension for consideration, it is possible that both are true or neither are. It's possible that he did not in fact do what you thought he did, or that he did it, but is not stupid or mean, or even crazier. Maybe he did it, and he is stupid, but this wasn't actually proof of it. It is possible that this act lies on a different function from that of stupidity, which is also crazy, that the whole thing could be true, but he might not have done this thing because he is stupid, even if he is in fact stupid. Actually, in a lot of ways, you're given too many options, which is maybe why people shy away from this. It makes life far less obvious when we're not so readily capable of drawing dividing lines between good people and bad people, good words and bad words, good actions and bad actions, right? It's scary to think of ourselves as bad judges of character, either for ourselves that we think we're better or worse than others, or that we cannot discern the goodness or badness of our actions, or for others, that we're at the mercy of the randomness, or we treat them as though they're good when they're not, or treat them like they're bad when they're not either, or presume they're better or worse than us for any single or host of reasons. Any way you slice it, this type of inability leads us to damning decisions, letting people in and trusting them when we shouldn't, pushing people out of our lives when they deserve to be in them, or being pushed out of others' lives without realizing whether we were good or bad for them, or if someone else is better for them or better for us. I mean, even the idea of better offers a space for contradictions, wherein we define better based off of a set of variables, and it may only be true depending on what variables we consider. So to say definitively that this thing is better than that depends almost entirely on what we are using to measure. Perhaps there is a way in which we could measure that statement as not true, or a dimension that does in fact exist, where none of it needs to be true, but it is scary to not know what is better, or who is better, or whether or not we're better. It's a frightening prospect to walk through life blind like that. And I'm not suggesting that type of life. The added complexity is hard, yes, but not insurmountable, or at least manageable. And attempting to realize the cracks in our vision and judgment is a far better route than, out of fear, refusing to double check the way we measure stuff and going through life mismeasuring everything and yet still wondering why our life ends up looking crooked. I'm not saying here that you should embrace some kind of enlightened detachment or giving up of discernment or anything so bold as all judgment is sin, but there is a reason the Bible warns against it. I mean, because we suck at it. It's not that judgment itself is a bad thing, it's just that we're so bad at it that when we do it, far more often than not, it is bad. Judgment ultimately is how we make decisions. We use our intellect, we collect information, we weigh information with desires, and then make a decision. And technically, that decision is a matter of judgment. We've decided some choice is better than others for whatever host of reasons. Even though we might say that we feel we made a worse decision or a wrong decision after the fact, in the moment we did exercise some kind of judgment in order to make the decision, and did conclude that it was better, even if it's because the decision we made took less mental effort. So maybe we didn't make the best decision, but we made the one that seemed best to us at the moment, based on a bunch of different factors. This connects obviously because the point of all of this is to point out the flaw of judgment, that we judge others and ourselves and ideas and realities and events off of incomplete data, and to find contradictions without functions and in limited dimensions, especially dimensions lower than the one we actually exist in, which in many ways just should be the definition of delusion. We can't walk around thinking the world is two-dimensional in our mind when we inhabit bodies which have 3 dimensions. The point of me saying all of this, and the point of you knowing it now, is simply compassion and responsibility. You are responsible for the ways in which your judgment fails. And taking accountability, admitting your shortcomings, and committing to thinking more cohesively about the world, and not drawing conclusions from data which cannot support them, but also to offer understanding for the shortcomings of our decision making and do the same for others in a truly compassionate and empathetic way, knowing we are all prey to the human condition. These types of contradictions limit compassion and responsibility. If we are right and someone else is wrong, then in a lot of ways, we are the good guys and they are the bad guys. And what we do is good because it's what the good guy is doing. And what they do is bad because it's what the bad guy is doing. And we're justified in however we treat them. This is the antithesis to virtue. It is the water we're swimming in, yet it is especially offensive to the virtues of compassion and responsibility. Weirdly, this is true when we make fun of actors or politicians or the rich and famous and say it's justified because they're powerful or this or that, and they're well off enough so they can take it, or even when we bully the bully and call it justice. The process by which we justified ourselves is so deeply flawed that it's intellectual suicide and moral bankruptcy to think that we're right in it. And actually, this is the only sin Jesus ever condemns. The Old Testament is filled with a ton of rules and laws. The New Testament basically only has two. The first one is love God and love your neighbor. The second one is just don't be self-righteous. The second one isn't even technically a law. It's more like a calling, and it's what Jesus models. Just don't act like you're better than people, or like you're justified in your actions or words or conclusions about others or yourself. I mean, Jesus is the literal Son of God and second person of the Trinity, and he never acted like he was better than anyone. Who are you to act like you are? Who am I to act like I am? So, if you want to use this information to say, ha, gotcha, to your friends and put down their ideas or arguments or thoughts or view of the world and demonstrate at once your intellectual superiority, if that's your cup of tea, okay, I can't stop you. But I can tell you the purpose I have for sharing this, which is to increase compassion and to increase responsibility. All of education, the purpose of learning anything at all, is truly to increase our capacity to love things about the world and others, ourselves, humanity as a whole, and God. If you want to use information to be right and prove why others are wrong, then I think you're learning for the wrong reason and walking through life blind. Contradictions are dimensionally dependent. If we could just consider more people, more of the world, more of ourselves, then things, sure, wouldn't be as clear. We couldn't walk around being justified in our words and actions, but we would be together, and we could see. And what we could see would look a lot better to us. I'm passionate about offering learning and increasing it in myself for the purpose of responsibility and understanding and compassion and love. So I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you keep coming along this journey with me. Let's keep musing.